every third Tuesday of each month, I host the Writer's Place Poetry Reading Series with my husband, Thomas Wilson. And this evening, we're very lucky to have Jo McDougall reading for us. She's an author of 5 books of poetry, most recently Dirt and Satisfied with Havoc. She is completing a memoir, Daddy's Money. She's a graduate of the University of Arkansas, and she has an MFA. And her work has been adapted for film, Emerson County Shaping Dream. It's been adapted for theater, a song cycle, and an artist's book. And that's what incredible diversity we're going to share this evening. And she has many of those productions and books at the back for sale at the end, and she'll be glad to visit with you and sign those pieces. An adaptation of her poetry titled Towns Facing Railroads was staged at the Arkansas Repertory Theater in the spring of 2006. She is published in such journals as the Georgia Review, Hudson Review, Kenyon Review, and New Letters, and was recently inducted in the Arkansas Writers Hall of Fame. She's a native of Arkansas, and she and her husband Charles live in Leawood. I am so pleased to see such a wonderful crowd, and I thank you for coming out on this beautiful evening to share with us and to hear the incredible work of Jo McDougall.
Well, who wouldn't be happy to be here by an introduction like that? Thank you, Judy. I wonder if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
No.
No.
Is there a way of turning it up?
No. I don't think so. Is that any better? Okay, I'll stand as close as I can for this then. But I want to thank the library and the Writer's Place for sponsoring this, and of course Jeannie for that lovely introduction and asking me to be here, and all of you for coming here. And thanks to Jim Miller for being at the back selling my wares, and to Bill DePlato, who is manning the camcorder somewhere so that I can have something new to put on my website, which hasn't gotten finished yet because I'm writing a memoir. Little did I know it would absorb almost all of my life for a long, long time. But anyway, the game plan is that I'll read some poems, some of them new, and I'll read some excerpts from the memoir. And the reason it's called Daddy's Money and not Father's Money is that in the South, grown men and women go to their graves calling their fathers Daddy. Besides, it's just more fun to say. And I'll talk about the pluses and minuses of going from writing poems to writing narrative prose. It's hard enough to write poetry. It's really hard to write prose, and I salute each and every one of you nonfiction and fiction writers and journalists out there. Then we'll have questions and answers afterwards, and then, as Judy said, I'll be at the back table. I don't want you to leave here without something. I have brand new DVDs made, hot off the press, of the film I made with Don Maxwell a few years ago that uses my poetry called Emerson County Shaping Dream. Well, I'm a poet and I'm writing a memoir. That should be normal sounding enough, but I've come to think of it as McDougall's memoir folly. And I think Charles would agree, my long-suffering husband. I've been at this now for about 8 years or so, off and on, and now I'm really on, and I'm a little over halfway through. this because it's such a challenge. I started to call this talk instead of From Poetry to Prose and back a poet's approach to memoir. In case any of you are here for class credit, well, you can tell your teacher you've got at least got the title. But I started to call this A Tale of Two Genres. A poet commits the folly of memoir and lives to tell about it just barely. But, well, Charles said that's just a little unwieldy, so no, I didn't do that. But here are the challenges that I have discovered in trying to write this memoir. Three main ones, besides the fact that I'm driving everyone in my family crazy with it. But mainly, I write short. My poems take a long time, but they're short. And now I'm trying to write long. And whoever told me that I could juggle scene, dialogue, fantasy, and fact, and fiction into one narrative pot called memoir. Then the second thing is, I've already written most of this in the books of poetry that I have. So why would I do this in prose? I keep asking myself. You know, I remind myself when I step back and look at myself at my desk. And I remind myself, you know, when you go to the zoo, you see those monkeys picking fleas off each other's backs. I remind myself of that. Kind of parting the fur of memory and picking out the best stories. Because stories are what everybody wants. I'm trying to pick out the best fleas. So now I think I'm just going to say, when somebody asks me, how's the memoir going, I'm just going to say, well, I'm picking fleas. So the third thing and the biggest challenge is I had a happy childhood. And I really don't know. I mean, what are you going to do with that? Nobody wants to hear about a happy childhood. But here I go, all through the wild blue yonder. I give you a little background, brief background of the memoir. For those of you who don't know much about the South, it takes place in southern Arkansas. And there's a difference between northern and southern Arkansas. It's not in the Ozarks. It's in land that's as flat as this floor. The 5 W's, the who, what, when, where, why. Well, the focus, the what, is coming of age on a rice farm during and after World War II. I'd love to say a war more recently, but, you know, I can't lie. World War II. It takes place during the formative years, my formative years, from 5 to 15. I kind of cut it off at 15 because that's when I really discovered boys and decided they were better than tractors. So that was that. And rice really is grown in Arkansas. A lot of people, when I tell them what I'm writing about, they say, I didn't know that rice was grown in Arkansas. Rice, Arkansas is the #1 producer of rice in the country, in the United States. It looks like, when it's mature, it looks like, almost like a field of wheat. And almost everybody here knows what wheat looks like. Except the heads bend when it's ready for harvest. And I think it's more elegant looking. But then I'm prejudiced, you know. So that's the setting is this. Just picture yourself in a white 2-story farmhouse surrounded by about 1,000 acres of mostly of grain, mostly rice, in a little close to a little town called DeWitt in southeast Arkansas, and that is the setting. The motivation, the why, I often wonder, why am I writing this? But when my father died, of course, then my mother was already dead, so it was left to my sister and I to settle the estate. And in so doing, one has to go through all that stuff that your parents accumulate. And oh, I pity my son when it's his turn, but there was so much stuff. My grandparents, both sets of grandparents, and my mother and father were pack rats. And not only that, my great-grandparents and my grandparents on my father's side, and then my father and mother all lived in the same, had lived in the same house as the generations died out. And the attic was unspeakably full of everything from adding machines to buttons to diamond rings to keys and everything in between. And I just got really involved with those people. Who were they? And then, of course, who am I? And how did they shape me to become who I am? Part of which is being a poet. Why did I become a poet instead of, say, a journalist or a bassoonist or a lion tamer? All of which would have made a lot more money. So I just started writing this to find out who I am. Now, some people have also asked me if there are the usual Southern stereotypes in this memoir. You know, the alcoholic brother or sister or mother, the crazy aunt, the person in prison. Well, fortunately not in the immediate ancestors. But my father's parents came from Belgium. And my maiden name is Garot, G-A-R-O-T, which I am almost absolutely sure is from the French word garrote, which means to strangle with an iron collar. So I'm probably related to stranglers, highwaymen, and hangmen, which may explain a whole bunch of things. I don't really want to know. One reason that one writes a memoir, I think, is that, as the poet Robert Pinsky said, deciding what to remember and how to remember is how we know who we are. Well, I thought tonight that I would read a few poems and something in the memoir related to those poems so you can see how I try to get from a moment in a poem to something more expansive, something with story, something with character and dialogue. This is a poem that deals with memory, with things and people lost. And in fact, it kind of sums up, I think, why people write memoir. It's called Summoning the Lost. Can you still hear me? I don't like writing about the dead, conjuring them in language that they, some of them, never would have used, pushing them on stage, saying, go. It doesn't have to be the truth. Something's varnished about that, all clique lights and rouge, all blistery shadows. Yet, what else is there to do? Shouldn't you, dear reader, be led to see those glossy, passionate, stumping souls who once plowed a field just short of a tornado, waltzed with a wooden leg, led an armadillo on a leash? Perhaps not. Perhaps you've already left the page, dealing with your own ghost, throwing him over your shoulder like salt, a grandmother, a child, a brother, missing in action, who smoked every day a pack of Camels and had a way with mules. Well, if I ever get the memoir finished, you will meet those characters who did have a way with mules. This is a new poem that has to do with my mother's house, and the houses that I knew in my growing up. My parents, my two sets of grandparents, had an enormous influence. They do, don't they? You never forget what your grandparents' houses look like, smell like. She remembers a house. After school, stepping down from the bus, walking between my father's fields, past the hollyhocks, my mother forgets to water, skirting my sister's bike, I enter that house, all our galoshes, pell-mell, on the porch. Home place. I remember my father when I was 6, pushing open a gate on the farm road, stirring the dust of August, the locust sizzling in the grass, a hum of dragonflies hanging sleepy above us. And this is the first page of the memoir. Very short. It's called the prologue, in which I expand on certain things. Mother places one foot on the chicken's head and yanks. The chicken flops a short distance in the stingy grass, blood spurting from its headless neck. I'm 9 years old, standing in the drought-bitten yard beside my mother. There are spatters of blood on her black shoes and brown cotton stockings, but she doesn't seem to notice. It's a summer morning in 1944, indecently hot on the South Arkansas prairie. And I know some of you are here who've lived in Arkansas, so you know what it's like, right, Dallas?
I do.
You do. There's no breeze. My father is in his rusted pickup, checking a rice field or fixing a broken tractor part in his shop, or feeding the cows. My sister, who will be my only sibling, is not yet born. The sun irons the moisture out of the sky, wilting the 4 o'clocks and the cannas along the backyard's broken cement walk. My mother slaughters 3 or 4 more hapless chickens, then turns to me. You do it, she says. It's time you learned. The chicken's severed head leans against my shoe. Its eyes have turned to gray film. I have chicken blood on my bare legs. My mother murmurs her approval. Good, she says, but next time make a quicker pull. You don't want to torture it. In my growing up, there had been an ample house, an elm to climb, a haystack, a barn. It smells of manure and wasting water. Beyond the barn, the huge Fairbanks Morse engines rose, tall as churches. They powered the wells, that pumped the water, that gave the rice, grew the rice, that made Daddy's money. Now bear in mind, it's all relative. I mean, what little my father had was fiercely fought over by my sister and me, and it wasn't, after all was said and done, that much. This is from chapter 1 called Money. Well, what else? The title's Daddy's Money. I gotta have a chapter in there called Money. There was money there, as they say in the South. But how much? Our father's estate, the source of bitter contention between my sister Nancy and me, escalating into litigation and roiling on for 6 sulfurous years, had been at various times valued as enormous, moderate, next to nothing. Who knew? Daddy, christened Leon Joseph Garreau, farmed 960 acres of rice, oats, and soybeans, but principally rice, on the Grand Prairie, that portion of the delta that had once grown prairie grass instead of trees. The farm was 75 miles southeast of Little Rock, near DeWitt, a town of 5,000 quirky souls, in 1935, the year I was born. See, the bad thing about writing a memoir is sooner or later you've got to kind of confess the time frame. The son of Belgian immigrants, Dad spoke no English when he entered 1st grade. Indeed, his French accent lingered on certain words all his life. I am devastated, he often said after my mother's death. Devastated. Other characteristics set him apart in that town, despite the prosperous times for farmers after World War II. My father dressed like poor white trash, favoring coveralls, vinyl boots, and a greasy felt fedora, summer and winter. There's not a thing wrong with that tractor, Dad would grouse when my mother, exasperated from hearing complaints about incessant repairs, suggested he just might buy a new one. It's got another good 10 years. You want us to end up in a poorhouse? Afraid, I suppose, of being perceived as flaunting his good fortune, he once bought a new apple green Lincoln Continental and hid it in the machine shed for 6 months. Despite the fact that he drove his vehicles till they died, hoarded burlap bags and string, wheedled every last dollop of toothpaste out of the tube, Daddy was, at least on paper, a man of moderate means. But, as they say, there was trouble in paradise. Even after my mother remodeled and redecorated the ancient house, acquiring all the appointments of furniture, silver, china, cut glass it could hold, she continued in her campaign to move to town. She wanted out of the stuff of which my days and nights and dreams were made of. The sounds of humming mosquitoes, crickets, bull bats at dusk, the sight of a red-winged blackbird, endless fields, honeysuckle, orange, aching moons, thick dust to walk barefoot in. Dust, Mother hounded my father endlessly. Dust and mosquitoes, I was sick of them. Our house was an easy 3-mile drive from town, but indeed the dust did billow behind the car in vaulting rooster tails. In spring and summer, battalions of mosquitoes sauntered through the finest of fine mesh screens. I want to move, Leon, Mother would say, usually right after supper as Dad was settled in his favorite shaker. My father would respond he was not about to move to town, that she had, after all, married a farmer. For God's sake, Ruth, you knew what I was when you married me, he would storm. He reminded her that she had a damn good life. If she'd wanted the trimmed grass, 9 to 5, know exactly what every day will bring you kind of life, she should have married that weasel she dated before him. An optometrist, for Christ's sake.